Almost lost. Okay. All right. So we are streaming live. So welcome. Oh, I better close it so I'm not listening to myself. So welcome everyone. There's a small change in the YouTube URL link. So Kate, who works with me, is behind the scenes sharing that link with everyone. We have to have our customary video fail, and that's it. It's over with for the day. So that's so like relaxing now to know that that's been taken care of. So welcome to our fifth, I think, D&I open source call. We have some really great people with us today to talk about inclusive open governance, as well as the, whoops, Kate was just asking for the new link, as well as the D9 in open source website. We're using HackMD for our agenda today. So if you have that open, I encourage you to add your name to the roll call, where you're from, your pronouns, and anything else that you would like to add. You can also give feedback on this Etherpad alternative, as our Etherpad was going away. And we had to try and figure out what plan B was. You can see the background on this task, which started with Dropbox paper, people wanting us to use an open source variety, all the different ones we looked at, all the different criteria for what that might be. If you're not sure how to edit it, if you scroll to the top, there is an eye to view the HackPad, and then a pencil to edit it, kind of like code style. So please do add your name. Also under the collaboration zone, if you need help from anyone on this call, remember we have a high number of people that watch the call afterwards. That's the place to put it. If you want to help with something, like you've got this thing that you want to do and you're excited about, but you need collaborators, do add that under the I can help with. Just make sure that you actually have the time to do that. There's also a links category, so please share your blog posts and other articles there. And right, so going right to our agenda. Sorry, we started a few minutes late. I want to ask Camilla and Jan from the Open Source Diversity website, that might not be your project name, so please correct me, to give us a little bit of background and information on the work that you've been doing. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Camilla, are you?
Great. Thanks for being here. Do you want to introduce yourselves first, Camilla?
Yes, I can start. It's fine. Sorry, I'm just a bit confused here with the Android app. Getting used to the setup. Sorry. So I am Camila. I am a software engineer for Nextcloud and part of Open Source Diversity. And well, I joined Open Source Diversity based on my own experience in open source as a woman being a software engineer and usually the only one in teams. And our project is a collective, so everyone can collaborate. So you can access and get more info in opensourcediversity.org. So our main goal here is to create like a hub, a place where you can look for other initiatives that help your project to have more diversity, to attract people from minorities. For instance, we have in our website links to your first PR up for grabs and other projects that incentivize diversity in open source. Because, you know, in tech, diversity is already really, it's a problem. And in open source, the numbers are even lower. Like it's between 1% and 11% of women and people of color that are part of open source projects. And other things that we do is that in Berlin and in other places like Albania, we organize meetups, and where you can join, and there we can help you and give you feedback in your project if you need help with, you know, how to attract more diverse people. rights to your project, like improving your README, improving your documentation, for instance, code of conduct, and things like that. Maybe Jan, if you want to add something, if I forgot.
And so, I mean, one of the reasons why we're pushing this specifically, like, or why it's also called open source diversity. I mean, it's also about inclusion, and it's also about free software. So we just had to have a specific name, of course. But we're seeing a lot of tech, or like women in tech initiatives or diversity in tech initiatives, but not so much in open source. Or I mean, there are a bunch of them, but they tend to not be as well known or as popular. So we wanted to have this intro page specifically for these projects in open source to highlight them. And so yeah, that's the specific focus. And I mean, this call, for example, and the mailing list is a part of that, for example. And yeah, so our other known projects like Outreachy, Rails Girls Summer of Code, Wheelmap, a lot of meetings or hackerspaces. And so yeah, it's at the moment still kind of like a landing page, mostly like an overview page, but yeah, it's also aimed at like growing these individual projects, for example. And there's also a list of articles, for example, that we yeah, keep linking to basically, or which are always linked regarding diversity in open source software.
Cool. It's really great to have that visual, like it looks like this website is a great opportunity to pull together all the initiatives and people and projects. And it sounds as well like you're having some events where you get together and work on that. How might people on this call or they're watching later participate? Is it a GitHub repo if they have ideas? Like, what does it look like to get involved?
So we have the meetups in Berlin on the last week of every month on a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock at Wikbar. In Albania, I believe it's in a hackerspace that usually do the meetups. And then we have our repository on GitHub, opensourcediversity.org. So for instance, in the last meetup, some people were actually creating their first project on GitHub. Some people help us with the website actually, and then we help them like to create their first PR on GitHub. Yeah, so we try to help people to get started in open source. If you join the meetup, you can bring your project, or you can bring your ideas of even to work on our website. And we can also give you feedback, like if you have a project and you want to improve like the documentation and other things that help to, again, reach out to minorities. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's also another meetup. I am not quite sure what the activity status of them is, but it's in Bangalore in India, and they're called Diversifying Open Source. And we've also reached out to them to join forces because it's very similar. And also the Berlin meetup was started based on a collaboration with a meetup or with a hackathon, actually, end of 2016. It started, organized by Wikimedia, called Ladies That FOSS. And yeah, we also so the organizer of that meetup is also part of open source diversity, and we had this process of going through what do we want to do with the meetup, and we also then ended up, for example, renaming from Ladies That FOSS to open source diversity, because yeah, we saw that, well, if we only say ladies, or if we only say it's only for women, it's a bit exclusive. And also you see that similarly, for example, I was also writing it on the mailing list. For example, Rails Girls, they're also renaming, or in the process of renaming from Rails Girls, I think likely to code curious, yeah, to not limit themselves to one framework or one language, and to outreach for women, but yeah, in general, to underrepresented groups.
Awesome. So on the HackPad or HackMD, so I'm still trying to find my language around this new thing. If you want to add there how people can get involved, I started to type what you were saying, but I'm also not a good listener and typer at the same time. So if you can just, and I know you have a GitHub repo, if you want to add all that information there, I think that would be awesome. Mm-hmm. And also you'll see that we just created a calendar for a shared calendar for D&I. If you want to add, if you feel like it, I think that people would appreciate knowing when those are happening. And you're more than welcome to add those into that calendar. I think that would be great. Cool.
And we will also on the website, for example, also we were also we also wanted to add, for example, the schedules of these calls. And so thanks for making that calendar. Now you can put the dates into there and
right. Thanks, and thanks to Sage who nudged on that. So hopefully we'll see a huge, well, not huge, but a flurry of activity at some point on our calendar that we can all know what each other's doing and work across projects. So thanks very much, Camilla. Thanks, Jan. Continue conversations in the HackPad and look forward to hearing more from this project in future.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to...
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to, pardon me, I'm just now moving you back to the attendees list, which is there we go. There's Camilla, and Jan is going to anyways, while I'm figuring out, I did it with one. I'd really love it if Jace and Aaron, who are here for our inclusive open governance call. I'm really excited. This is like a much broader conversation. There's a lot of code of conduct conversations, which have been really valuable. But when we're setting up and running projects, what does it mean to make diversity and inclusion part of the core way that we run projects? How do we, what kind of successes and failures have we seen? What ideas do we have? And I'm really grateful to have Aaron Turan from Rust here today and Jay Singer-Dumar from Google and Kubernetes. But I'm going to actually ask you to introduce yourself first, and I'll go with Jace because you're on the first square of my screen.
Okay. Well, first of all, Emma, thank you so much for this incredible service that you provide to our communities. This is not a trivial amount of work, so it's really great that you're investing your time and effort and passion and energy into this. And I know that I speak for many people when I say thank you for doing it. So in that vein, it is a huge honor to be here and to share time and ideas with everybody in this call. I'm basically responsible for open source governance at Google, and where I'm sort of honing those things is in the Kubernetes project, because it is a project I'm most familiar with and involved in. And it also has some really interesting scale issues because it's an extremely popular, very fast moving project with a very large community. So all sorts of things are happening there that we need to learn from and get better at and do the best we can. So that's really where I'm working now. My background is in kind of a mix of open source applications and operations and executive management operations. So I've managed large groups of people and strategy and around that. So I've seen both sides of the coin in terms of representation in ops groups that I walk in to manage, which is an interesting viewpoint, and also just participating in open source communities as a consumer and just learning more about the communities as somebody who's observing as opposed to necessarily coding in them. So it's a different viewpoint.
Thanks, Jace. Welcome. So glad to have you here. Aaron.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm Aaron Turan. I work at Mozilla, so I'm happy to be one of Emma's colleagues, and Emma has been a huge help to my work at Mozilla. And I sort of have two distinct roles related to Rust, and I'm always careful to try to separate these roles. One is I manage the Rust team at Mozilla. So we have 7 people working full-time at Mozilla on Rust, and I manage that team. But then separately, I am also essentially a leader of the Rust project as a whole from a community perspective. And we've worked hard to distinguish between these two things because it's been really important for us in the Rust project to make it a multi-stakeholder project, even though it was started at Mozilla. We don't want it to be a completely Mozilla-owned project. And so I'm sure we'll be revisiting that as we go through some of the governance issues later, but it's been really important to us to seek viewpoints outside of Mozilla and so on. In terms of my background, I was initially sort of coming from an academic perspective. So I did a PhD in computer science, and I was planning on doing research around programming languages. But then I had a couple kids and decided that success in the academic world would require too much sacrifice on that front. And I lucked out hugely to land in this position at Mozilla. So I think in a lot of ways, the transition from an academic environment to an open source environment was natural in terms of doing things in the open, rather than for commercial gain or whatnot. But there are also massive differences in the ways these worlds operate. And we may touch on that a bit later as well.
Unmuted. Thanks, Aaron. So great to have you here. And for those that are watching, I decided to have just one or two people on this call that really had this background. And I think that that we have a lot to learn from our guests today. Now, I have a set of panel questions, and how this works is I'll ask the question, but if there's other things that occur to you, and you don't have to answer in order, whatever occurs to you. And also for those that are on the call, there is a questions feature in Zoom, and if you find it, please use it, and I will try to get those out. There's also a space for questions on the HackPad, so I will keep my eye on both of those as well as the chat. So, and then I'll surface those to you, Jason, Aaron, as needed. So the first question is, diversity and inclusion in open source is often an afterthought, or appears to be an afterthought, with the burden of work feeling like it's done by those that are most impacted. Do you have any examples of how governance can make inclusive practices more central to project goals and operation? And I guess I just add there, and thus more of everyone's job?
Aaron and I are probably going to be staring at each other awkwardly as we try to answer the question.
I'll pick on you if I have to.
Yeah. I'm happy to start just briefly, because this is something that is really a primary part of my job. So working in open source at Google is great because you have all this systemic support for open sourcing projects internally and making sure that projects are built for success from the beginning. So this is something that Google and certainly all the great people who are involved in open source here understand, that D&I is core and fundamental to project success as having great software. They're inextricably linked right now, and I think that realization has taken a lot of time to understand. Certainly Kubernetes has brought that to the forefront, because as a massive project, the community being successful is often called out as much as the software itself. So I really believe we've reached an age of maturity for open source software where people do see the value of community, and especially having a diverse and inclusive community, because those things immediately promote a multi-spectrum view on the things that are being created, and less echo chamber, less sort of defects in terms of inclusion or usability. That all these things that have to be present in a project to be really successful, the more that those are exposed from the beginning through diverse viewpoints, the better the project is. So I feel like Kubernetes is, thanks to a lot of hard work. I mean, I credit Sarah Novotny as one of the incredible thought leaders for this, and she was so involved in Kubernetes community building from the beginning. That's I think a really stellar example of that in practice. She has developed a set of tools and practices that can be applied to any open source project, and and those things are starting to propagate through the things that we do here and else in the community. So I feel like that's a good one, and I'm sure there are plenty others. But Erin, your thoughts?
Is there, you mentioned like a set of standards that Sarah uses. Do you know are those available somewhere to, or you don't have to like answer that right now, but if you have those sort of resources available, if you wouldn't mind, like you can email them to me or add them to the PACs. I think probably a few people's ears perked up that there was a resource that we might.
Well, right now it's not documented in a way that's consumable. It's just a collection of things. However, that is something that I'm going to be starting that work myself, of kind of getting a toolkit together. And I believe there's somebody on deck, hopefully, that will be hired to take that work over and actually make sure that it's done as a consumable unit. So I would love for us to see that get out and share it with the wider world.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question, and it's something in the Rust world we think about a lot. Sort of like what Jace was saying with Kubernetes, I think Rust also is known sort of as much for the technology as for the community. So I have a ton to say here, so please feel free to like cut me off at any point. I think that the two things come immediately to mind in terms of making D&I sort of not an afterthought. And one of them is maybe kind of obvious, but it's the kind of thing that it's easy to give lip service to and not actually do, which is that I think it's vital that the visible project leaders, like the people who are really calling the shots with the technical direction of the project and who everybody's sort of looking to for guidance, that those people are deeply invested in D&I and that they talk about it and sort of live it. And I think, it's similar, I guess a similar aspect of that too is the importance of diversity in the leadership itself. So, and I want to be clear, Rust is, I think, pretty well known for its inclusivity. I think on the diversity side, we're still struggling. And, we have a lot sort of working against us. We heard stats about open source in general, and then Rust is playing in an area that's also just generally very unbalanced. But one of the key ways that we try to attack that problem is by focusing on getting leadership at the very top level that is diverse and is not just a sort of token thing, but is sort of front and center. So, we've had some success along those lines, but it definitely has taken a lot of work. So number one, clear investment from leadership. Number two, I think that there's a sort of old school ethos around open source that all that matters is the code. That the whole way that the community interacts is just show me the code, and that's tied in with these notions of meritocracy and so on, and it ignores both the human factors of decision making, consensus building, and so on, but it also ignores a lot of facets of software that go beyond the code that are really important. Sort of like Jace was getting at, how D&I perspectives actually also produce better software as a whole. So one of the other really important things Rust does, we have structured governance in a sort of rough hierarchy. So we have the Rust core team, and that's sort of the overall steering and direction of the project. But then we have a bunch of more area-specific teams, and the leader of each of those area-specific teams sits on the core team as well. And we've used that to treat non-coding concerns in a first-class way. So we have a team that's working on the Rust compiler, which is like the core of the language. But at the very same level of hierarchy, we have the community team that works on, events and outreach and so on. And then we also, even within the more technical aspects, of Rust, it's not always code. So we try to create spaces where people can contribute ideas or designs, even if maybe working on the compiler itself is intimidating or out of scope for them. So we try to value just a wide range of kinds of contribution, and again, we do that very visibly and explicitly, and that's one of the ways that we make space for a broader diversity. And I think when we talk about diversity, I think we often highlight underrepresented minorities and so on, and I think that is very important. But there's all kinds of other diversity too, and that again goes back to Jace's earlier point that I think Rust would not be as strong as it is as a piece of software if we didn't have people coming from this wide variety of backgrounds. Okay, I'll do one other quick thing and we can move on. I guess the final really big thing that we do that's sort of aligned along these same themes. So Rust has developed its own sort of outreach program, and Emma actually helped get that off the ground last year. We're in our second round of that this year. It's called Increasing Rust Reach. And I think there were a couple of really big insights around how we structured that that may be useful for other communities as well. So number one, I think that diversity initiatives often get conflated with mentoring initiatives. There's often a framing that sort of says, we are starting at the beginning of the pipeline, and what you need if you are not part of our usual audience is a lot of hand-holding to come in. And that there's definitely value in that work, but we wanted to try an approach where we very explicitly were not mentoring, but rather there was an exchange of value in both directions. So, if you are coming from a non-traditional background, if you are an underrepresented minority, you have really important perspectives to offer us, and we are actively seeking that from you. So it's not, in our terminology, we didn't pair you with a mentor, we paired you with a partner in the Rust project, and there was an exchange of skills. And as part of that also, and again, this goes back to the leadership really putting their money where their mouth is, mentoring in general and other kinds of initiatives along those lines is really important in Rust, but we put a special priority on this partnership where we bring the top leadership of Rust in and have them either work directly with the people coming in this initiative, or in some cases we just have like weekly calls where they can chat with Rust leadership. So we just, again, very visibly show that the leaders care, they are investing their time in these people specifically. We actively want you to be here.
There's a lot of great stuff in there. Thanks, Aaron. And if you, again, with links like Increasing Rust Reach, I think if you've done any blog posts on or anything that other projects can learn from, I think that was a good example. I didn't realize it, but when you articulated that you have, the coding and the community at the same level, I really like that idea as well. Really, in our research, and others show that we tend to value code more. So I think that's a great step to do that. So those resources. I'll move on to the next question here, which is, so this actually came from, we just removed the word meritocracy from Mozilla's governance page. We had research that said that word was problematic, and so having it like front and center in our governance page was something we changed. And just on the hackpad down below, if you're interested, there's a quote from Mitchell. Sorry, somebody just said source. From Mitchell Baker that actually turned up on the governance thread as she approved that change. So I think it actually really, for me, it articulates why moving away from the word meritocracy is important. Should anyone else here be trying to make a similar argument, just as a helpful thing. So the next question, so what I'm trying to say is that this question actually came from that thread. There's somebody that was very concerned about something. So his name was Henry, and his question is, to the extent that open source leaders, module owners, decision makers, enablers, coordinators are drawn from the population of contributors with either financial freedom or organizational support from their employers. And I would also add things like time and access to technology. Do you think that grant systems, internships, or similar can help surface these more diverse leaders? And have you seen that happen?
Jace, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, yes, is the answer to that. That, and we need to do so much more of that. So what we've seen is the diversity scholarships that have enabled people to come to KubeCon, for example. Many people who attended that as underrepresented peoples have now become important and critical contributors to the project. Nikita Raghunath comes to mind, who's somebody who now works for Red Hat. She basically worked up from just being a starter contributor to now being a key part of many of the parts of the projects, just simply because she was engaged, had the opportunity to meet people face to face, and built the trust as a result of those opportunities. It's so important for us to try and call out the privilege that we have all the time so that we can find ways to share it. If we're like, for example, if you're on a panel with people and you know, one of the ways that we share on a panel is to give time to other people, or if you're going to be speaking at a conference, how do you share the stage with somebody? Or, you know, basically it's scholarships, it's enablement financially and otherwise, but it's also having people who have the privilege trying to find ways to call out that they have it and share it. And so I think that that's financial, it's time, it's skills and interests, it's opportunities at companies, it's a million things. So this list that is provided is a good start, and I definitely would love to see us augment that with many other ways of doing that. And it absolutely works. I could go on and on about people who've stepped up through these processes in Kubernetes and done incredible things. So yeah, so much that.
And I'm sure everyone would love to learn. So anytime that you're able to share any of that, I think everyone's very interested. You know, when you were talking, it also reminded me that, and back to code contributions, if we value code contributions as higher than others, we also value people with more time than others, and that sometimes shows up when we have like top committers, right? Those tend to be, you know, maybe people with more time and access. And how do we, like, through our recognition system, and I don't have the answer for this, just so you know, and so I don't expect you to, how do you surface those, make recognition more inclusive as well? And, you know, someone can do a really amazing contribution, and then someone else who does like a bunch of little things which are still valuable, you know, might still have more, like, seem like the more productive contributor. I'll just leave that there. That just occurred to me as another way that we need to think about things, perhaps.
I can just quickly add that for the Kubernetes community, we specifically call those people out in our weekly community meeting. We have a shout outs channel on Slack.
Yeah.
And basically people will nominate others that have done things. Oftentimes it's not code contributions. It's so-and-so spent an hour traversing the issue pool to see what was important, or somebody helped me review this thing, or somebody, it's always, you know, I've never seen anybody shout out like, man, those four lines of code that you wrote those are the best 4 lines I've ever seen. And but that doesn't in any way negate those contributions either. It's a mix of skills. So I feel like Kubernetes has done a really solid job of calling out a variety of contributions, and also represented in our governance model, which I'm happy to talk about that as well at some point if that's interesting. But essentially, yeah, we try and make recognition a big deal. And there's actually an award that was given out at KubeCon last year, which was the Chopping Wood and Carrying Water Award, basically for people who had done a lot of really unglamorous work and that was super important for the project. It wasn't coding, it was really just cat herding and trying to make sure that things get done on time, and that there's you know, assistance across the project for people's efforts. So I feel like I'm truly thankful for our community. It's exceptional, and it's something that I wake up every morning and feel so cared for, and so close to everybody that I work with in the community. So I feel good about that. And it's something that I think we have a lot to get better at, but I think we're doing okay.
I love the chopping wood and carrying water award. I think I might have to steal that in some way, but it's open, so I won't be stealing.
It was actually a log glued to the bottom of a bucket, FYI. So it's not easy to get past the TSA in your luggage because it looks.
So yeah, to build on this a bit, I think I find this question really fascinating because it goes to the heart of some of the tensions in open source. Like there's a sense in which open source is just a privileged kind of activity to be involved in. But it's one of those things that sort of goes both ways, because there have been lots of times in the Rust community where I've seen people's volunteer involvement in Rust ultimately lead to doors opening for them that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And that's partly due to proactive efforts from the Rust community. So, it can play both ways, but I think this is a really tough and interesting question. So a couple specific ideas along these lines from the Rust world. One, so the question mentions organizational support from their employers. One of the things we're starting to do, and we have a lot of work still left, is to really proactively reach out to employers and sort of set up this frame of these are the ways that you can give back to Rust. These are the ways that you can get plugged into the community. So one thing that we can do is basically try to increase the number of people who can be involved in Rust during their paid time at work, sort of as a proactive thing. We're sort of at the beginning stages of that. But in terms of volunteer work, I think, going back to the Rust Reach program I mentioned before, we sort of specifically designed that to be a high leverage use of people's time. And so, we have an application process. We generally get 300 applicants, and we pick like 10. It's pretty tough, but the expectation from the participants is pretty minimal in terms of the time that they have to spend in this program. So it might only look like 3 or 5 hours a week. But in exchange for those 3 or 5 hours, as I mentioned before, they're paired with leaders at the very top of the Rust world. So the work that they're doing in that 3 or 5 hours gets amplified far more than would have been possible if they were just completely on their own trying to figure out where to fit in the community. And similarly, one of the things that we give all of the participants is, travel and tickets to attend a Rust conference of their choice, where we also highlight them and sort of just draw attention to the work that they've been doing. So I guess, the bottom line there is with, again, this visible, dedicated effort by leadership, you can help people make a lot more from the limited time that they have and just make a larger impact, get larger visibility, and so on. So that's something that's worked pretty well for us in the Rust world.
Yeah, like the not much time. On the side note, we're looking at running helping people in like career transition use open source, and for example, people on maternity leave, coming out of the military, that sort of thing, diverse people, and definitely like time comes up as something that we would design that way. So that's interesting. I'll probably be asking you more about that later. Awesome. So, and people, we're recording this, but if there's anything that Aaron or Jay said that really resonates with you, I'd love if you wanted to help note take underneath some of these questions, because my multitasking limit is met. I'm trying to, but please do feel free to try and do that, because there's some really awesome things being said. So the next question is, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's okay, I can summarize. Mozilla recently released these open source archetypes. This is a draft, which has essentially gone out and tried to identify the types of projects in open source. So there, you can take a look at that later. Diversity inclusion is not really a part of these yet, which is why this is where this question is coming from, which is for those that are essentially, there's archetypes, sorry, where people are essentially building for themselves. And that could be, and this comes from Patrick, who worked on the archetypes. And he said Rust developers building Rust. I don't know, Aaron, if you agree that that's the right, if you would describe them that way, or people who are building for others versus Linux. And I would add like a third type, you know, like a small toxic group of people that are working on software. You know, is there a difference in how diversity and inclusion should be applied to those archetypes? And I know that some people have argued that, you know, don't push inclusion on us, don't push, and I've even recently heard the word inclusionists. So, like, I'm just wondering, do you see a difference in how diversity and inclusion can be applied to types of projects like yours? And I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, so Jason, if you don't mind, I'll go first, but try to make it quick. Yeah, so this was kind of interesting, you know, in that there's this call out to Rust in terms of the archetypes, and I in fact don't agree. Okay. And in fact, I kind of see this distinction as somewhat of a false dichotomy. You know, anything that you're building in open source is both for you in some sense and for other people in some sense. And in particular, you know, when people come to contribute their volunteer hours toward a project, there's always something that they're personally connecting with. And that doesn't have to look like literally using the software themselves. You know, it could be some other aspect of just enjoying the process or whatnot. But one thing this framing does make me think of for Rust is one of the ways that I almost want to turn the question around, that one of the benefits that we get from trying to attract a more diverse community is a greater ability to see things from the perspective of the other people who are using Rust. So I think a lot of the sort of more traditional parts of the Rust community, you know, the less diverse parts, tend to be very much scratching their own itches and just thinking about, you know, what do I care about in Rust? And sometimes they can get very bent out of shape about specific features, you know, that are sort of their pet thing or whatever. Whereas, you know, in the spaces that we have managed to attract a more diverse crew, you can really see the shift in focus, you know, a deeper understanding that there's a large pool of different kinds of users of Rust, and we need to be thinking big about how we shape this project. We can't just look at our own personal desires.
Yeah.
I think that's great, Aaron. I think you raised some really good points. I would add that one of the interesting and unexpected outcomes of great projects like Rust is that other communities, like Renetti's, for example, look at how you do governance and crib from what you do. So sometimes a project is more than just the project. It's a community, and communities, as we know, are messy and they're peoply, and there's all sorts of, you know, things happening all the time that are not about the project itself. It's all the ways in which people collaborate as the human interactions, the technical interactions, the way governance shapes and frames those interactions. So I believe archetypes, I guess maybe in the Jungian sense, is really a way for people to understand generalities that exist within ourselves that we can put a name to. And so projects that have generalities like this are good as a way to help describe them, but it's always a generality. And so, you know, the generalities help in the sense we can classify projects to understand what they need from perhaps different skill sets or things like that. But there's a base level of inclusion that is table stakes for every single project. It doesn't matter if two people are trying to move a picnic table or they're trying to build a great piece of software as a community. Like there's a certain amount of base inclusion that I think benefits every single human interaction, and it's something that is proven time and time again that if two people are set aside to move a picnic table, one of those two people might have a better way to do it, that if they were thinking the same way, they wouldn't necessarily see that. So we have to, in a way, I think, Aaron's, the use of dichotomy is a big thing here, because the more we think of things in terms of dichotomy, the less we're able to empathize and understand that we're all trying to solve, all these problems in our own ways, and that everybody's way has its own merit and value, and it's important to understand and recognize that. And when you force a dichotomy on something, you're basically forcing a decision point between your way or my way, and oftentimes it's our way. That's the way in which we succeed. That is, as human beings, that is how we have gotten where we are. Is not by lone wolving our ways through the world. It's as a community. How do we surmount really difficult challenges? How do we take these ideas that we share together and create something that vastly exceeds the capacity of one individual? And that is really the heart of open source collaboration, and why inclusion and diversity are so critical to these efforts.
Ooh, thanks, Jace. And thanks to whoever's taking notes. I found my first flaw in the hackpad that I don't know who to thank. There's no authoring here. So thanks to whoever's doing that. Last question, I want to leave a few minutes at the end for you to add anything that I haven't already, that you haven't had a chance to articulate. This one is around code of conduct, is an important part of governance. I wanted to make sure I got one in here, which is that right now making a code of conduct enforcement real and trusted in open projects is a major hurdle. In part because, and this is something we've witnessed, people fear that longtime established contributors who feel, and I put here who are core to, but I would say who feel core to development might be impacted. And so we have some famous examples of people that have stayed in projects despite toxic behavior, but it's an ongoing and recognized issue even in HR. There's that white paper on toxic impact on people leaving and sick time. So how do you deal with the types of fears, knowing that some people likely leave when we don't deal with those people? Have you encountered fears around removing or addressing someone's behavior? And how would you strategize or recommend other people do the same thing?
Don't all jump at once.
Yeah. Why don't you go first, Jace?
Okay, well, this is top of mind for me right now because I'm involved with the Kubernetes Code of Conduct and helping review that document and think about that. So what I've had to come to as a way to explain this to people, specifically about Code of Conduct, is that, and I think this helps frame why we're doing this and what it's for and all those things, and is that really there's two ways that you run into a code of conduct. The first way is you are reading it as an academic or somebody who's interested in it, or like, wow, I wonder what this is, and let me understand what the rules of engagement are for this community, or what are those things. And the other way is I'm reading this because I just had my life fundamentally altered in a very negative, crushing way by something that just happened to me, and I need to understand what my rights are and what I should expect of what's happened next in my life as somebody who's had that changed by somebody else against my will. So when you weigh those two things, the academic reading of a code of conduct and the victim's view of the code of conduct, for me, it makes it pretty clear about which way the scale should tip in terms of who that should serve. And so when I read the code of conduct, or when I help draft or do those things, I'm constantly thinking, like, what is the victim's perception or experience, or what is their realization of this? And obviously I'm trying to put myself in the place of that and ask people who've been through those situations to try and to make that more true. And so I guess using that as my sort of the Occam's razor of how I decide, how to frame things or to use the language, is this part of the code of conduct re-victimizing somebody by asking them to do something that is not necessary? Or, so those questions, to me, that sorts out a lot of the sort of who is disenfranchised by this, this code of conduct, because, I mean, people who are academically disenfranchised, like, wow, this is infringing on my rights. I understand that. I totally get that. And I want to be sensitive to that. But I also, somebody who's had their life change out from under them against their will, that has more weight in my opinion. And so I guess that's where I fall on this. And that's really my own personal opinion. In a way that I've tried to frame my own involvement in this, because the code of conduct is a notoriously thorny issue, and something that's really hard to do well. And the contributor covenant is really a good place to start for a lot of those things. That's what we've looked at as well for Kubernetes. Yeah.
Sage Sharp, who's on the call, has some suggestions around shifting language there that might be helpful to you and to others. There's still so much to learn about this, so I'm definitely glad to be building a network of allies around that. Aaron, did you want to add on to that?
For sure. This has been an interesting aspect of the Rust community, in that the project started from day one with a code of conduct, and the sort of originator of the project cared a lot about these issues. So, in a way, like, we started off in a good place, but the question is somewhat focused on enforcement and trust. And one of the things that initial code of conduct failed to do was lay out a clear mechanism for how do you report issues, and what happens when you do that, and what are the possible consequences, and who makes those decisions. And we had a very formative experience early on, where we had, it's the classic case of a really technically savvy contributor who over time became increasingly toxic. And this person was also a very skilled politician. And so, like, when we were trying to sort of call out this behavior and refer to the code of conduct, they very quickly adopted, the core team is trying to silence my technical opinions by wielding the code of conduct. And because we didn't have the clarity around how and who enforcement would happen, and because this person had so much stature, it was really difficult to deal with this problem. It was unclear sort of what route would be least damaging to the community in some sense. Ultimately, that person left the community, and we just sort of presented the consistent front of both listening to and carefully responding to the technical points, but then also in separate comments, calling out and saying that, this kind of discourse is not acceptable. After that incident, and like I said, this was early in the process. A few months later, we sort of introduced a lot more structure into Rust's governance. Some of the team structure that I mentioned before, and one of the things we did, again at that top level of teams, is introduce an official moderation team, and clarified responsibilities around enforcement. And a key stipulation is that to avoid conflicts of interest and these kinds of accusations around technical views being silenced, no one on the Rust core team is allowed to sit on the moderation team. So we have a clear split between those things, and that's one of the ways that we've been able to build trust. And it's been an interesting experience in that there have been times where I personally have been very frustrated by somebody in the community and felt like they were stepping out of bounds, and I, sent mail to the moderators and demanded that they take action. But because they are this separate deliberative group that's looking at the bigger picture, they were able to approach it with a little bit more detachment, and in some cases help people integrate into the community in a better way instead of just kicking them out. I think, but so the other thing to say is like, I think code of conducts, there are these two aspects to them in the sense that, you know, on the one hand, I mean, it's sort of like laws, right? There's the letter of the law, there's the spirit of the law, there's culture around these things. So I think there's a way in which these are also symbolic steps that are sort of setting the norms for the community, even when you're not talking about enforcement, you know, or sort of drastic actions. They're still putting focus on the ways that we want to interact and trying to build that into the culture. And I think for Rust, partly because this was so visible early on, we have a pretty good baseline culture. You know, it's generally a pretty safe space. But some of the challenges we're facing now are, you know, things where people aren't attacking each other or harassing each other, but they are dominating in more subtle ways. You know, not giving other people the space to, you know, to comment just because they're sending comments like crazy or whatever and sort of overwhelming. And I don't have a good handle on how to solve that one. That's kind of the next challenge on this front for Rust.
Oh, I was muted. So I'm conscious that we're at time and I want to respect your time. So I'm going to wrap up here. And thank you so much for that call. There's so much in there. Definitely, if you have time to add more of the things that you've mentioned in the Etherpad. At the bottom, there's a topics proposal for next time. So one of them is a code of conduct regular section where we can help each other, which might be valuable. So if there's anything you'd like to propose, I'd love to see it there. Otherwise, we'll see you on the internets. And I'm grateful for a network of people that care about this. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.